Bob broadcasts a transaction paying Mallory and possibly other people. Mallory pins Bob's transaction. Bob doesn't realize he's been pinned and bumps the fees using either RBF or CPFP. Because Bob's original transaction was pinned, his fee bump doesn't propagate. However, Mallory receives it somehow. Steps 3 and 4 may repeat multiple times to greatly increase Bob's fee. Mallory mines Bob's highest fee bump, which nobody else is trying to mine because it doesn't propagate. This allows Mallory to earn more fees than other miners. Mallory can now use replacement cycling to move her transaction pin to another transaction and repeat the attack, possibly with a different victim, without allocating additional funds, making the attack economically efficient. We don't judge the vulnerability to be a significant risk. Exploiting the vulnerability requires specific circumstances that might be rare and can result in an attacker losing money if they judge network conditions poorly. If an attacker did regularly exploit the vulnerability, we believe their behavior would be detected by community members who build and use block monitoring tools. All right. So this is uh, a vulnerability that is pertaining replacement cycling attacks. Okay, so first we'll try and understand what a replacement cycling attack is, and then we will try and understand how replacement cycling attack can be used by a miner to their own benefit, right? To their own benefit. How an avenue of exploitation can open up for a miner to leverage it and use this replacement cycling attack to disincentivize other miners on the network, right? So first, let us try and understand what replacement cycling attack is, because without understanding that, we won't be able to comprehend what this vulnerability is. Let's try and read together and understand what replacement cycling is, right? So replacement cycling is an attack against CPFP key bumps and transactions using hash single that allows an attacker to remove an unconfirmed transaction for the mempools of relaying full nodes without leaving an alternative transaction in its place. It mainly affects multi-party transactions that depend on CPFP key bumps such as those used in LN, right? So what's replacement cycling attack? Firstly, what CPFP? CPFP is child pays for parent, right? So we all know that in Bitcoin, to broadcast a transaction and to get your transaction mined, you need to pay a fee, right? You need to pay the miners a fee for them to mine your transaction, right? And if the fee that you are paying to mine a transaction is very low, then the miners will not be incentivized to mine your transaction, because prominently the miners give preference to transactions that are paying them a higher fee, right? And if your transaction that you broadcasted or that you intend to get mined is not paying adequate fee, then miners will not be incentivized to mine that transaction. So in this situation, what can you do? Either you can wait till a miner decides to eventually mine your transaction, or other avenues is that you increase the fee that you're paying, right? You increase the fee that you're paying. And there are multiple ways for you to do that. One of them is CPFP. What's CPFP? It's an acronym for child pays for parent. So if you have a Bitcoin transaction that you've broadcasted to the network, but none of the miners are willing to include that transaction in a block because they're paying a very low fee, then you can attach a child to that transaction. You can attach a child to that transaction, and you can ensure that that child pays a high fee. So now the miners will be incentivized to mine both the transactions, the parent and the child. Why? Because even though the parent is paying a low fee, the child that you've attached now is paying a high fee. So the combination of the child and the parent cumulatively pay the miner a high fee, right? So this is what we refer to when we say CPFP in context of Bitcoin. And I'm going into this much detail, which I usually don't, because a lot of you guys are pretty new to Bitcoin, right? So for you to be able to deduce sense out of it, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible, right? That's what CPFP is. It's child pay for parent. If a Bitcoin transaction that you broadcasted is not paying adequate fee, then you can bump its fee using an exogenous mechanism by attaching a child to it, and the child pays a high fee. So the cumulative fee of the couple, of the parent and the child, goes up, and then the miners get incentivized to mine your transaction because of the high fee that the child is paying, right? That's what CPFP is. Okay, now replacement cycling is an attack against CPFP fee bumps and transaction using sig hash single that allows an attacker to remove an unconfirmed transaction from the mempools. What's a mempool? Mempool is basically a data structure where unconfirmed transactions are stored, right? Usually, the mempool size, the default mempool size for the most popular Bitcoin implementation, that being Bitcoin Core, is I believe 300 MB, right? So you have 300 MB of space allotted on your node to store unconfirmed transactions. From that mempool of unconfirmed transactions, you handpick transactions to include in the block, right? So mempools of relaying full nodes without leaving an alternative transaction in its space. It mainly affects multi-party transactions that depend on CPFP bumps, such as those used in LN. Okay, so here's an example. Mallory and Bob may share funds as in an LN channel. LN channel is a lightning channel, right? A lightning channel is basically a layer 2 protocol for Bitcoin. It's basically a layer 2 protocol for Bitcoin. It's a multi-party contract. It's a channel that is opened and closed by a multi-party contract, right? So Mallory and Bob, in our assumption, are two users of the Lightning network that share a Lightning channel with each other. Mallory and Bob may share funds as in an LN channel. Each of them has a unilateral exit transaction, such as an LN commitment transaction. So whenever there is a Lightning channel between two participants, we have a provision of unilateral exit, right? Because if one of the participants does not want to continue being a part of that Lightning channel, they should have a clause that they can trigger to exit unilaterally, right? So each of them has unilateral exit transaction, such as an LN commitment transaction, and that unilateral exit transaction in the Lightning Network is known as a commitment transaction that they can publish on chain at any time to terminate the fund sharing arrangement. To allow either of them to fee bump the transaction, it contains at least one output each of them can spend in a child transaction for a CPFP fee bump, right? So these Lightning transactions basically, or these lightning channels, they are initiated with a transaction that is known as a funding transaction. As a funding transaction, where in our example, Mallory and Bob come together, they put their funds in a two of two multi-sig account. They put their funds in a two of two multi-sig account. And immediately when they set up or establish a channel, they have to create a commitment transaction that allows them to opt out of this channel whenever they want to, right? Now, the catch here is that this is a pre-signed transaction because when you're initiating or when you're starting a lightning channel, you have no idea when you're going to close it. You have no idea when you're going to close it, or even if you have an idea when you're going to close it, you're not going to have an idea of what the fee market would look like at that point in time. So usually what happens is that in such pre-signed multi-party contracts, the fee is kept very low. The fee is kept minimal, and then you bump the fee when you want to broadcast the commitment transaction because you cannot predict the fee beforehand. So the more cautious approach is that you set up a low fee when creating the commitment transaction at first, and when you want to broadcast the commitment transaction of a pre-signed multi-party contract, you analyze and you gauge what the fee market is like, and you create a child transaction which pays an adequate fee, and then you attach a child transaction to that commitment transaction to ensure that the cumulative fee that is paid by the commitment transaction and its child transaction is good enough, adequate enough to incentivize the miners to mine your transaction, right? So if Bob wants to terminate the fund sharing, he can broadcast his unilateral exit transaction. Now, this unilateral exit transaction has two versions, right? One is controlled by Bob and one is controlled by Mallory. And at any point in time, if one of them wants to unilaterally exit the Lightning channel or any pre-signed commitment transaction, then the party that wants to unilaterally exit can broadcast their version. So Mallory has her version of the unilateral exit transaction, which is the commitment transaction, and Bob has his version of the unilateral exit transaction, which is the commitment transaction, right? Now, let's say if Bob wants to terminate the fund sharing, if Bob doesn't want to continue this Lightning channel, as in our example anymore, then Bob has the prerogative to broadcast this commitment transaction unilaterally without the consent of Mallory, meaning Mallory has already signed that transaction. So Bob is not in need of any more prerequisites from Mallory's end. Rather, Bob just needs to broadcast this transaction. So if at any given point in time Bob wants to opt out of it, then Bob will broadcast his version of the unilateral exit transaction, along with the child transaction as discussed for the CPFP bump. Mallory has the ability to broadcast her own unilateral exit transaction with a higher fee child transaction, right? So just now we discussed that Bob and Mallory both have their own versions of the unilateral exit transaction. Now let's say Bob broadcasts his version of the unilateral exit transaction. Mallory can broadcast her version of a unilateral exit transaction, right? Paying a higher fee than Bob. In this situation, what will happen? Bob has broadcasted his version of the transaction, and Mallory has broadcasted her version of the transaction. Now, the catch here being Bob and Mallory both have the same inputs. So, Bob's version of the unilateral exit transaction has the same inputs that Mallory has in her unilateral exit transaction, right? And two different transactions having the same inputs cannot coexist in the mempool, right? One will evict the other. And usually it's the one that pays a higher fee that will evict the other, right? So if Bob wants to opt out of this multi-party contract by broadcasting his unilateral exit transaction, Mallory can prevent Bob from doing that. How? By broadcasting her own version of the unilateral exit transaction and paying a higher fee by than what Bob is paying. In this situation, what will miners do? Obviously, miners cannot mine both Bob and Mallory's transactions because they contain the same input, right? And double spend is not permissible in Bitcoin. It violates the consensus rules and the very existence of Bitcoin for that matter. So the miners have to make a choice. Either they mine Bob's transaction or they mine Mallory's transaction. Now, in this case, Mallory is paying a higher fee. So the miners will be inclined to choose whose transaction? Obviously, Mallory's transaction, right? Now, because the two exit transactions spend the same inputs, they conflict. And Bob's lower fee exit transaction will be replaced in mempools with Mallory's higher fee alternative. That's fine for Bob. In the protocol, he doesn't care which exit transaction gets confirmed. Either transaction will end the fund sharing arrangement, right? So even if the miners remove Bob's transaction and mine Mallory's transaction, it's irrelevant to Bob, right? At the end of the day, what Bob wants in our example is to exit this multi-party contract, right? Whether he exits it by broadcasting and mining his own version of the commitment transaction, or whether Mallory's version of the commitment transaction is irrelevant, right? So even if the miners evict Bob's version and mine Mallory's version, it's irrelevant and insignificant to Bob because eventually Bob gets what he wants. That is, Bob exits the multi-party contract, right? But here is where the catch is, right? However, after Mallory's alternative exit transaction has entered mempools, she can replace her child transaction with another conflicting transaction, this one with no relationship to either exit transaction. This replacement removes Mallory's alternative transaction, leaving the mempool devoid of any transaction that terminates the fund sharing arrangement, right? So now what do we have? State one was that Bob broadcasted his commitment transaction. State two was what? Mallory broadcasted her version of the commitment transaction with the higher fee. So the minus evicted Bob's transaction and included Mallory's transaction in the mempool. Now what does Mallory do? Mallory broadcasts another transaction, right? Mallory broadcasts another transaction which is completely unrelated to this to this multi-party transaction that Bob and Mallory co-own, right? Bob and Mallory co-own a multi-party transaction which is parked in the 202 multi-sig. Now Mallory broadcasts another transaction. Here we're talking about a third transaction that is getting broadcasted. The first was Bob's commitment transaction. The second was Mallory's commitment transaction, and the third is an unrelated transaction that Mallory broadcasts. But what is the catcher? The catcher is that the third transaction that Mallory has now broadcasted shares the same inputs that the child of Mallory's commitment transaction has, right? So Mallory's commitment transaction's child shares its inputs with this third transaction that Mallory has broadcasted. And now we again have a conflict, right? Initially, the conflict was between Bob's commitment transaction and Mallory's commitment transaction. Now the conflict is between Mallory's commitment transaction's child and a completely unconnected or unassociated third transaction that Mallory has broadcasted. We have another conflict, right? And what Mallory can do is that Mallory can ensure that the fee of this third unconnected transaction that Mallory has broadcasted is higher than the fee of the child of Mallory's commitment transaction. So in this situation, what will happen? The miners, as we just discussed, will lure towards mining the transactions that have a higher fee. So the miners will choose Mallory's third transaction or the completely unconnected transaction and evict Mallory's commitment transaction. So Bob is prevented in this situation by Mallory from exiting unilaterally this multi-party contract, right? Because when Bob tried to exit this contract unilaterally by broadcasting his commitment transaction, Mallory prevented him by broadcasting her own version of transaction with a higher fee. And when her own version of transaction with a higher fee was included in the mempool, and Bob would have exited this contract unilaterally, had Mallory's commitment transaction been mined, Mallory immediately broadcasts a third unrelated transaction which conflicts with Mallory's commitment transaction's child, thereby even evicting Mallory's version of the commitment transaction, right? So Bob is prevented from exiting this contract unilaterally because his version of the commitment transaction got evicted, and then even Mallory's version of the commitment transaction got evicted, right? And Mallory can keep on doing this again and again and again. Every time Bob broadcasts his commitment transaction, Mallory can broadcast her commitment transaction to evict Bob's commitment transaction, and then Mallory can broadcast a third transaction which is completely unrelated to any of these commitment transactions, but it shares an input that is common to the child of Mallory's commitment transaction, thereby evicting Mallory's commitment transaction as well, right? So this is what a replacement cycling attack is, right? It is an attack that prevents users from unilaterally exiting a multi-party contract. So if Bob and Mallory have a lightning channel which Bob wants to exit, Mallory can prevent him from exiting this channel by using this replacement cycling attack. And the only way for Bob to circumvent this is to constantly keep on broadcasting his commitment transaction and hope that at some point in time his commitment transaction gets mined. So he'll probably have to keep on increasing the fee till he outpays Mallory and the miners eventually decide to mine his version of the transaction. Because if Bob does not fail to do that before the HTLC expires, then Bob will end up losing uh, his entire fund. So people who understand how the Lightning Network functions is that the commitment transactions come with a time lock. Within that time lock, that transaction needs to be mined, otherwise we lose the funds that are associated with it, right? So if Bob is the beneficiary of an HTLC, then the commitment transaction of either Bob or Mallory has to be mined within a certain time lock. If Mallory can continue executing this replacement cycling attack again and again and again till the HTLC expires, then Bob will be deprived, or in fact, Bob will lose all the funds that Bob was supposed to be recipient of in the HTLC, and Bob will lose all of its channel balance. So this is what a replacement cycle attack is. So as we can see, Bob's exit, Bob's UTXO. This is, like Bob. First is that Bob broadcasts his version of the commitment transaction. Then Mallory broadcasts her version of the commitment transaction. That's step two. Then Mallory broadcasts a completely unrelated UTXO, but it conflicts with Mallory's child transaction. It conflicts with Mallory's child transactions. The first one gets evicted by the second one, and the second one gets evicted by the third one, right? And for Bob to exit this unilateral transaction, either first has to get confirmed or the second has to be get confirmed, right? But before the first gets confirmed, Mallory broadcasts the second, and the first gets evicted. Before the second gets confirmed, Mallory broadcasts the third, and the second gets evicted as well. So this way, Mallory can keep on performing this replacement cycle attack and thereby prevent Bob from exiting the Lightning channel. We'll just read this till the end. Then we'll see if you have any questions. Bob can broadcast his exact same exit transaction and child transaction from before, but Mallory can repeat the sequence of steps to remove his transaction from mempools, although she need to use a different UTXO or pay a higher fee rate to use the same input each time. The cycle of Bob rebroadcasting and Mallory re-removing is what presumably gives replacement cycling its name. Replacement cycling is especially concerning in protocols that use time-sensitive transactions. For example, forwarded HTLCs in LN must be resolved within a certain number of blocks. If Mallory is able to use replacement cycling to prevent Bob from resolving HTLCs forwarded to Mallory within a certain amount of time, Mallory can steal from Bob, right? So this is the point that most pre-signed transactions, especially in our example of the Lightning Network, come with a time lock. And if Mallory can prevent Bob from unilaterally exiting the channel within that time span by performing the replacement cycling attack again and again and again, then Bob will lose all of its channel balance, all of his channel balance, and Mallory will be able to successfully deprive Bob of his share of the channel balance. So that's broadly what the replacement cycle is. Now that we understand what a replacement cycle is, we can move forward and try and understand the specific vulnerability that's discussed in this week's Optech newsletter. If anybody has any questions, any doubts, or anything that they'd like to share about the replacement cycling attack, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak, or you can even post something in the chat. Any questions, anyone?
So what is the problem that occurs? I didn't get what is why that replacement cycling is works.
Why does the replacement cycling work? So if we talk
Yeah.
about the lightning network, okay, the when you want to exit the lightning network, right, when you want to exit the lightning network, you have to broadcast the commitment transaction. So the lightning network is a layer 2 protocol for Bitcoin. It starts with a transaction which is known as the funding transaction, right, and it is
Okay.
terminated with a transaction that is known as a commitment transaction, right. When you want to broadcast a commitment transaction, it comes with an HTLC. It's a hash time lock contract. Okay. So that commitment
Okay.
transaction has to get confirmed within a time span. Okay. You have a time lock. Within that time span, you have to ensure that that commitment transaction gets
Yeah,
mined.
yeah, yeah.
What your counterparty can do is that they can prevent you from getting it. They can prevent you from getting that transaction confirmed, right? So Bob and Mallory share a commitment transaction. They jointly own a UTXO, an unspent transaction output, right? When Bob wants to
Okay.
unilaterally exit, Bob broadcasts his version of the exit, right? So there are two versions. Bob has his own version, Mallory has their own version. If any one of them gets mined, then they can unilaterally exit a contract. So let's say you and I have a contract, right? And
Yeah.
we take an affidavit, all right, and we mention the clause on the contract, and you have a copy of it and I have a copy of it, right? Both of us can execute it, right? But we have specified a clause that within 6 months, let's say both of us have to execute this contract that is in this affidavit. If in 6 months we are not able to execute the terms in this contract, then the contract is invalid. So this is pretty similar to that. Within a certain time
Okay.
log, if you are not able to mine that commitment transaction, then you lose your funds. So Bob wants to exit that transaction. Bob broadcasts his version of the commitment transaction, right? Now what Mallory does is Mallory broadcasts her version of the commitment transaction. Now these are conflicting because eventually they are the same inputs, right? The versions are different, but the inputs are the same, and two
Hmm.
transactions having the same input cannot be mined at the same time, right? You cannot spend the same Bitcoin twice. You can only spend a Bitcoin once, right? So either Bob's version gets confirmed or Mallory's version gets confirmed. Now, who decides whose version gets confirmed? The miners will give preference to the version that is paying a higher fee, right? So Mallory will ensure that she pays a higher fee so that the miners evict Bob's version and give preference to Mallory's version. Now, before Mallory's version gets mined, Mallory will broadcast another transaction. That's the third transaction. Now, this transaction is completely unrelated to this two of two multi-sig account that is jointly owned by Bob and Mallory. But this transaction will have uh, inputs that are common to Mallory's version of the commitment transaction. So you can see Mallory UTXO, Mallory UTXO, right? So now there's a conflict between these two. First, there was a conflict between these two. So this got directed,
Hmm.
this got selected. Now there's a conflict between these two. Now miners have to choose whether this one they want to go with or this one they want to go with. Mallory will intentionally ensure that this one, the third one, pays a higher fee. So the miners will kick out the second one as well and choose the third one, right? Now Bob's version of the commitment transaction, that is Bob's affidavit in our example, does not get executed within 6 months. Even Mallory's doesn't get executed in 6 months. So the clause lapses and Bob loses all of its fund. So if you have a lightning channel with someone, you want to attack them, you want to rob them of their funds, you want to deprive them of their funds, you can perform this attack to ensure that
A particular
the
time
commitment
limit.
transaction is not broadcasted timely. It gets evicted from the mempool and they lose all their funds. They can keep on doing that again and again and again till that time lock lapses. That's what the attack is.
Okay, okay, okay. What I get means there are in the contract within a time limit. Within a time limit, that lightning attack can happen. You want to prevent using some methods.
Right. So that's one of the hash time locked contract. You can look into it further what the hash time locked contract is. So it's a contract
Okay.
after this contract is broadcasted, it needs to get mined, confirmed within a certain time. It comes with a time lock, right? Now Mallory can
Time.
keep on performing this replacement attack till that time is over, till that time is lapsed, and then after that, the funds that Bob will be recipient of will not go to him. That is, the funds that were locked with that HTLC will not go to Bob. They'll come back to Mallory. So Mallory will get
Okay.
Bob's share of the funds. Okay,
Okay.
all right. Yes, not Goss has shared a transaction replacement link of Wikipedia where you guys can go and explore what transaction replacements are. You guys can also explain explore what HTLCs are for those of you who don't know, and then it'll make more sense. So now we know what replacement cycling is. Let's understand replacement cycling in the context of the vulnerability that is discussed this week. Is my OneNote synced? I made a nice diagram on my tablet on OneNote, and I was expecting it to show up on my MacBook, but I don't know. It's not sunk. It seems it should be here. Anyways, I'll have to do without a diagram now. Okay, so we just go into directly the gist of. So this is the mail that was sent to the Bitcoin development mailing list. We not go through the entirety of it because of time constraints. We just look at what the vulnerability is. Now that we know what a replacement cycling attack is, now that we know what HTLCs are, now that we know how replacement cycling attacks can be used to exploit multi-party contracts, we will try to understand an avenue of exploitation in context to mining. How can a miner exploit a replacement cycling attack? You just read that specific part. Where is it? Okay, it's here, I guess. We read from here. I will zoom it a little. A simple replacement cycling attack on a miner mempool example. All right, so here's the attack. Let's say Mallet and Murray are both miners with equivalent hash rate capabilities. That is the same odds to mine a block for a given period, right? So let's assume there are two miners, Mallet and Murray. Alice is an exchange doing batch payment to pay its users withdrawing funds from the exchange, right? And we have a third character known as Alice. What does Alice do? Alice runs an exchange, right? And exchanges usually issue their deposits in the form of batch, right? Like they batch payments for multiple users and then they disburse those payments together. Mary is a solo miner with limited CPU, memory resources, and she's refreshing her mining jobs with a get block template only once by minute, right? So Mary is a solo miner, okay, and Mary is refreshing her mining jobs with a get block template only once by minute. Usually, miners create new block templates every once in a while, right? Because you constantly have to change your nonce to get to guess what the valid nonce is, right? So we can't go into details of how mining happens, assuming that most of you understand mining, Bitcoin mining at a higher level, right? So usually there is this command get block template, right? That your mining software gives to your Bitcoin node. And when your Bitcoin node receives this command, your Bitcoin node goes into your mempool and fetches the most uh, monetarily incentivizing transactions, assuming that's the thumb rule, and fetches those transactions and creates a block template for you, right? If any of you use create your if any of you are miners and you create your own blocks using datum or you using stratum v2, then you guys, if you've ever looked at the logs, you'll see that every few seconds you'll get a log get block template, get block template, get block template, right? So your software, your datum software or your stratum v2 software is constantly instructing your Bitcoin node to furnish new templates, right? So let's assume that Mary is a home miner with limited CPU resources such that her software, her datum or her stratum v2 software is instructing her Bitcoin node to create a get block template just once in a minute, right? So we have three characters to understand this attack. One is Mallet and one is Mary. Both of them are miners having almost same hash power. Now Mary is a home miner, right? And her node is creating a template on an average once every minute, right? And Alice is an exchange runner that issues batch payments to its users. Now, during the setup phase of the attack, Mallet opens up two low value accounts at Alice's exchange and waits for the time lapse of the next batch payout to be reached to ask her two accounts to make a deposit, right? So Mallet is the attacker. What will Mallet do? Mallet will open an account in Alice's exchange, right? A small account with a small UTXO, right? And when Alice is issuing batch payments to her clients, Mallet will also ask Alice to issue the two UTXOs that Mallet deposited at Alice's exchange, right? So Alice builds a batch payment transaction with n outputs for her honest users and two more outputs from Mallet, right? So what does Alice do? Alice creates n outputs, like we just discussed that exchanges usually they issue batch payments, right? So if there are 1,000 people who want to withdraw their funds from an exchange, the exchange will not create 1,000 different transactions for 1,000 users, right? Because that incurs a lot of fee. What they'll do is they'll create one batch payment, one input that will pay 1,000 users, right? Because that is very cost efficient. So Alice builds a batch payout transaction with n outputs for her honest users and two more outputs for Mallet. The transaction is finalized and broadcasts over the network of mempools for inclusion in the block template. The Alice batch transaction is of size 1,000 with 10 payouts for a fee rate of 2 satoshis per virtual byte, right? So in our example, Alice issues uh, outputs to 10 of its users, right? Out of which two outputs are for Mallory, right? So in the batch payment transaction, there are 10 outputs, 8 of which belong to honest users, 2 belong to the malicious user, in our example, that being who Mallet. As soon as Alice's batch transactions start to propagate, Mallet consumes its two outputs with two chains of junk transactions to reach max package limits, 25 descendants, and block the carve out, right? So now what happens is that in Bitcoin, most of you must be aware that an unconfirmed transaction can have an unconfirmed child, right? So for you to broadcast a transaction, it's not necessary that its parent needs to be confirmed, right? You can broadcast a transaction even when that transaction is unconfirmed. You can create a child of that transaction, and that child is also unconfirmed. You can create another unconfirmed transaction, and you can keep on adding them till you reach the limit, which is currently 25 descendants, right? Which is currently 25 descendants. That's the limit. I believe that's a policy limit for Bitcoin Core and its folks, right? So you can have 25 unconfirmed transactions at the same time, meaning the parent is unconfirmed, the child, the grandchild, the great grandchild. So you can have 25 descendants that are unconfirmed. What does Mallet do here? Mallet has two outputs, right? So Alice has issued a batch payment which has 10 outputs, 8 of which are for honest users and 2 are for Mallet, right? What will Mallet do? Now these two outputs that are for Mallet are unconfirmed. Mallet will attach children to those unconfirmed outputs, because just now I mentioned that an unconfirmed transaction can have children, right? So this unconfirmed outputs that belong to Mallet will attach children to them. Till what extent? Till Mallet reaches the limit of 25 descendants, right? Till that transaction has 25 descendants. After 25 descendants, you can't add any more children, right? Now, what is the catch here? At the start of the session, we discussed what a CPFP is, right? Child pay for parent. Because in Bitcoin, you have to pay a fee to the miners to incentivize them to mine your transactions. And if your transaction is not paying adequate fee, then either you have to wait for a miner to eventually oblige and mine your transaction even with a lower fee, or your transaction will get expunged out of the memories of the miners mempool, or the third option is that you bump the fee of the transaction and you spend it again, right? A nice analogy that I can give you is one of our participants a couple of weeks gave a nice analogy of an Uber. If any of you have ever booked an Uber or an Ola, it might happen at times that you might be waiting to find a cab, but it's been 5 minutes or 7 minutes and you've not find a cab, right? And then what happens is that you get a message from Ola or Uber saying that, hey, if you add a 50 rupee tip, there is a higher probability of you getting a driver. So you add a 50 rupee tip and then immediately you get a driver, right? So it's similar to that. You broadcast your Bitcoin transaction, and because you're paying a low fee, none of the miners want to mine your transaction. But then when you pump the fee, the miners get incentivized because they're getting paid more and they decide to mine your transactions, right? But there is a limit to it. One way of doing this is known as CPFP, which is what we discussed at the advent of the session, right? When you attach a child to that transaction, okay, and that child bumps the fee. In our Uber analogy, it gives a tip, right? But the catch here is that in Bitcoin, you can only attach 25 descendants, right? And what our attacker Mallory has done is that Mallory has already attached 25 descendants, right? So if Alice wants to further increase the fee of her batch payment, she cannot do that because Mallory has already attached 25 descendants to the batch payment that Alice broadcasted. Now, Alice cannot add any more children to it, right? So the junk transactions are of size 150 bytes and feed it to Satoshis per virtual byte. And they have two parents, one Alice's payout UTXO and one Malit's UTXO. Starting from this point, Alice's exchange server logic should either, okay, so now what has happened is that Mallet has attached children to that transaction, to that Alice's transaction, which are paying a very low fee. which are huge in size and are paying a very low fee, right? So that entire cumulative set of parent and child, all those 25 descendants, are not getting included in the blocks of other minors, right? Because until and unless the parent is not mined, the child cannot be mined, right? And the entire set is paying such a low fee that the minors are not incentivized to include that batch payment of Alice. So now Alice is known as two options, right? Alice is not broadcasted the transaction. Now Mallet has added descendants to that transaction with a low fee, due to which Alice's batch payment is not getting mined. Now Alice's node, when it observes that the transaction is not getting mined, has two options: either to attempt an RBF of the batch transaction. RBF is replaced by fee. It's basically you create a new transaction, quote unquote, and pay a higher fee with the same inputs. So that is the first option, as there is no global mempool. Alice is uncertain on the explanation for the lack of propagation of a batch transaction. It is most likely she will broadcast a fee rate increase in the dark, right? Now, Alice is not aware that Mallory has attached children, right? Alice is only aware that her batch transaction, which was broadcasted some time ago, has not yet been mined. But Alice is not aware that Mallet has attached child transactions and has usurped that entire limit of 25 descendants in the mempool, and that is the reason due to which Alice's batch payment is not getting mined, right? So Alice, being clueless, will do what? Alice will bump the fee of her batch payout. To replace Alice's parent's batch transaction and Malin's junk transaction, a replace by fee must have an absolute fee superior to 9,800 satoshis. The replace by fee transaction is assumed to be blocked by Malin at by Mallet as this absolute fee. So its fees are 9,800 satoshis. The fee rate increase transaction or RBF or CPF should be negated by Mallet, outbid by the constant cycle of replacement junk attack, right? So what happens? Alice bumps the fee of her uh, batch payout transaction. Now Mallet will again do the same thing. Mallet will again attack children, this time with a higher fee, and again block Alice's batch transaction from getting mined. Now Alice will again probably bump the fee, and Alice will keep on doing that, and Mallet will also keep on doing that, right? Now where does the catch come? The catch comes here. Okay, we discussed that there are two miners with equal or approximately equal hash rate. One is Mary and the other is Mallet, right? And we discussed that Mary is a home miner who only triggers the get block template RPC command once in a minute, right? Now this might happen within a minute, right? Alice might broadcast her batch transaction. Mallory might attach children to that batch transaction, right? And then Alice might rebroadcast her batch payment with a higher fee. Mallory might again attach the descendants to that batch fee, right? Now, what will happen is that because Mary's node Mary's node does not refresh its block template frequently, it refreshes its block template only once in a minute. What can happen is that Alice might not see, Mary might not see Alice's batch payment with a fee bump. Mary might not see Alice's batch payment with a fee bump, and and Alice might uh, uh, be under the assumption that Alice has not rebroadcasted her batch payment. Thereby, Alice might include in her mempool and in thereby Mary might include in her mempool and in her block the original batch payment which Alice broadcasted, which is a low fee, right? Which is a low fee transaction. So if Mary ends up mining Alice's batch payment, then Mary gets a low fee because Mary is a home miner and her block template is not getting refreshed very frequently, due to which she has an older version of Alice's batch payment. And if Mallet somehow manages to mine Alice's batch payment, then Mallet will mine Alice's batch payment with a higher fee. Why? Because Mallet is frequently refining and recreating her block templates and keeping a track of Alice's fee bumps, right? So this is an attack in which you can artificially trigger somebody to pay a higher fee than they ideally would have. Like in our example, Mallet triggered Alice to pay a higher fee than she ideally would have. And if the transaction gets mined by Mallet, then Mallet will be the beneficiary of that artificially high induced fee. And if Mary gets to mine that transaction, Alice's batch payout, then Mary gets to mine the older version because Mary, being a home miner, is not aware of Alice's fee bumps, right? So this is how a miner can exploit a replacement attack to artificially force a transaction that is broadcasted on the network to pay a higher fee. And if they mine it, they mine a higher fee version. And if another miner mines it, who is not frequently creating or refining their block templates, then they get to mine a lower version of the transaction. The transaction with a higher fee. So in our example, if Mary gets to mine the Alice's batch payment, then Mary will earn 7,000, 8,000, sorry, 9,800 satoshis. And if Mallet gets to mine Alice's batch payment, then she gets 1,007, that's 17,600 satoshis, right? So this is how a miner can use a replacement cycle attack to their own benefit, thereby disincentivizing a rival miner or somebody else on the network, right? And the solution to this is what one solution is cluster mempool. Now we can't go into the details of what cluster mempool is. In short, cluster mempool does away with this 25 descendant limit, right? With this 25 descendant limit. So Alice can attach another child, and Alice is not in need of rebroadcasting the entire transaction. That could be one way of doing that, right? And there are other mechanisms as well that have been proposed, chain of transaction topological restrictions or UTXO based transaction announcements, right? Due to time constraints, we won't be able to go into it. So those of you who are interested in learning what the mitigations the developer has proposed at your own comfort and time and convenience can read through this mailing list, right? So this is what we had to discuss in this newsletter or in this article to which we've given a lot of time. We tried understanding what CPFP is. We tried understanding what replacement cycling is. We tried understanding what pre-signed multi-party contracts are. And we tried understanding how a miner can exploit replacement cycling attacks to exploit people into paying a higher fee, and thereby, if they mine, they get the higher version, and if somebody else mines, then they get a lower version of the fee, right? So if, like, I'm assuming some of you guys are new, if this is pretty overwhelming, please don't get demoralized, because this is a session in which we discuss slightly intermediate and advanced level of topics. You need to have a surface level understanding of Bitcoin. You need to have a certain surface level understanding of Bitcoin's protocol. You need to have a surface level understanding of what a mempool is, of what ancestor descended limits are, of how the Lightning Network functions, of how Bitcoin mining happens, what RBF is, what CPF is, CPFP is, what CPFP carve out is. You need to understand all of these things to try and appreciate and admire and understand this exploitation. So if those of you who are relatively new to Bitcoin were not able to comprehend this article in its entirety, don't feel demoralized. This is not intended to be for absolute beginners. If you were able to understand 10, 15, 20% of it, then great, you can build on top of that. But before we move further, if anybody has any questions, anything to share, anything to ask, please feel free to do so. I'll pause for 60 seconds and then we'll move on to the Bitcoin Stack Exchange question and answers. And we'll probably take 2 or 3 questions and try and wind them up in 10 minutes because we're already at the 9 p.m. mark.
I just had one question that what are some of the resources that one could refer to for knowing about the underlying processes of how Bitcoin transaction works? Because this is really something overwhelming as of now, but I think that with proper resources, someone can understand them.
Mastering Bitcoin. You've heard
Yes,
of this book, Mastering Bitcoin?
yes, I've heard that.
Yes. So if you want to attend our Monday sessions, and if you want to understand, uh, see, I mean, firstly, these sessions, it's possible that you might spend 5 years in Bitcoin and still not understand some of the things that we discuss here, right?
Yes,
Because Bitcoin is a very diverse topic, so not everybody understands everything, right? So, but still, if you want to leverage these sessions, and if you want to be a part of the conversation, not here, elsewhere as well, then mastering Bitcoin is like the bare minimum that you have to know. It's a first stepping stone. If you don't know mastering Bitcoin, then whenever there is a conversation happening about Bitcoin that's technical, you'll feel lost. All right. So mastering Bitcoin is something that you have to do. You either do it on your own or you do it with Bitshala. We have cohorts, like I told you. You have two options now. Registrations are over, but still you are more than welcome to join. Okay. We have completed 2 sessions. We'll have a third session on Thursday. You can join. We probably will cover chapter number 5 and 6. You can prepare with chapter number 5 and 6 and show up you'll not get completion certificate, obviously, because you did not register. If you want a completion certificate, then maybe you can wait for about 5 or 6 more weeks and join in April. And if you're not concerned about certification, then you can join Thursday onwards. Okay, you'll not be a registered participant, but you can benefit from the discussions. But the gist being, if somebody wants to understand the basics of Bitcoin tech, then Mastering Bitcoin is the first book that you start with. So whatever suits you, you want to do it on your own with friends with Bitshala, but start with Mastering Bitcoin. That's the best thing. That's the best book to start with. And then once you've done mastering Bitcoin, then you can start attending these sessions, and then slowly and gradually you'll get to know about new topics, new concepts, and you'll understand things better. For Bitcoin, it's mastering Bitcoin. For Lightning, it's mastering the Lightning Network. So if you can finish these two books, Mastering Bitcoin by Andres Antonopoulos and Mastering the Lightning Network again by Andres Antonopoulos, if you can do these books, then you have the founding stone to build on top of, and you have the bare minimum amount of knowledge that every Bitcoiner should have. Then you'll be able to appreciate the concepts that we are discussing. I
That's
hope I've
great.
answered the question. Right?
Yes, yes. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Most welcome.
Sir, miners are playing important role here.
Minus, sorry, what about minus?
Yeah, minus means which I'm saying which charge the bitcoins when transaction happen.
Right, right. Miners are the ones who to whom you pay the fee, right? So miners are basically
Yeah,
solve a proof of work, right? Yeah. So basically, there are two types of Bitcoin nodes. There are multiple types of Bitcoin nodes, but broadly, if I had to classify, I classify them in two types: mining nodes and non-mining nodes. So there are participants on Bitcoin network that don't mine, right? They just relay transactions, and then there are people who mine transactions. For that, you need equipment known as ASICs, right? So initially, people used to mine using the CPUs. When the compensation when the competition became dense, people started using GPUs, right? And then when the competition became even more dense, people started using ASICs. So there are mining companies now. There are passionate Bitcoin miners, home miners who mine Bitcoin. You have to pay a fee to them, right? So the more fee you pay, the higher is the possibility of them mining your transactions, right? So miners are facilitators who settle the Bitcoin transactions on the blockchain, and you have to pay money to them. I mean, in terms of Bitcoin. Okay. All right. So we'll take one or two questions because we're at 9:05, so I won't make you guys wait for too long. By 9:10, we'll wind it up. We'll take two questions. Which ones should we take? Let me see. Let me see. Let me see. Okay, let's take this one. Let's take the less complex one, so that our audience tonight can try and make the most out of it. Okay, so basically, this is also a nice website. Okay, for those of you guys who are new, bitcoin.stackexchange.com, you can go there, right? So you'll find this is like a question bank for Bitcoin. So whatever questions you have, you can search here. You'll find hundreds and hundreds of questions. You'll find answers. If you have questions, you can post your questions here, and experts will answer your questions. So let's cover a couple of questions. In the Bitcoin's block genesis, which parts can be filled arbitrarily, right? So Genesis block is Bitcoin's first block, right? Currently we have I don't know how many hundreds and thousands of blocks. I think more than 800,000 blocks. So Genesis block is the first block. What's unique about Genesis block is that Genesis block was hard coded. All the other blocks of Bitcoin were mined. They had to comply with certain set of consensus rules, but the Genesis block did not have to comply with the consensus rules, and the Genesis block was hard coded, right? So this is some of the fields that a block has, right? The Genesis block can be broken like this. So Genesis block has the version number, it has the hash of the previous block, which obviously does not exist because the Genesis block is the first block, so it cannot have a previous block. Then it has the Merkle root, which is the hash of all the transactions that are in the block. It has a timestamp, it has bits, it has the nonce, which is the number that you need to find that ensures the difficulty is below or greater than the mining difficulty. Number of transactions. The Genesis block had only one transaction, version number, one transaction, one input, right? So these are some of the fields that Genesis block has had. So now the questioner asks that Since the Genesis block is a hard-coded block and it is not a block that gets validated in accordance with the consensus rules, was it possible that the Genesis block could have any value, right? Because these are the values that Genesis block had, right? The version number was this, the previous block hash was this, the Merkle root was this, blah blah blah. These are the values of the hard-coded Genesis block. The questioner asks, could it have been possible that Satoshi would have chosen any other values and would it still have been a valid block? So the answer is this, depending on context, all of them or none of them. Bitcoin could have used any Genesis block. The Genesis block is not a normal block and is not subject to the normal block validation rules. It is definitely the zeroth block of the Bitcoin chain and thus unconditionally valid. Its contents is entirely irrelevant and so its fields could be anything, right? So the answer says it depends on what perspective you're asking this question from, right? So before the Genesis block was hard coded, yes, it was possible to use any arbitrary value, right? So like the script length could have been different, right? The timestamp could have been different, right? The public key could have been different. The lock time could have been different, right? Satoshi could have changed these values, and still it would have made no impact to the legitimacy or the validity of the Genesis block, right? But now that there have been blocks that have been mined on top of the Genesis block, right? After the Genesis block was hard coded by Satoshi and blocks were mined on top of it, second block, third block, fourth block, content block, blah 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 block. Now you cannot change that. Now you cannot change it. Bitcoin uses a specific Genesis block and no other. However, the Genesis block is definitely the zeroth block of the Bitcoin chain, and no other block is changing anything in it, and it no longer meets our definition, so nothing can be changed, right? So when Satoshi was hard coding or he did not hard code it, he could have used arbitrary values. He could have changed the script pub key, he could have changed the version number, he could have changed the time lock, right? At that point in time, he could have done that. He could have changed the Merkle root, right? But now that he hard coded it and now that he mined blocks on top of it and other people have mined blocks on top of it, now it is not possible to change the Genesis block, right? Because you have to undo the entire chain, all the 800,000 blocks that have been mined on top of that Genesis block, you'll have to undo all of that, which is practically infeasible, right? So the answer is says it depends on what perspective you're coming from. If you mean, could Satoshi have chosen another Genesis block? Yes, he could have. Can we change the Genesis block today? No, we cannot, right? So that is what the answer is. We'll take one more question and then we'll wind up if y'all don't have any questions from your end. Right, let's take this one. What are the harmful effects of a shorter inter-block time, right? For those of you who don't know, a Bitcoin block's time interval is approximately 10 minutes. The Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment algorithm is programmed in a manner that, on an average, it takes 10 minutes for a block to get mined, right? So the questioner asks, what if it's less than 10 minutes? Like, why do we have to wait for 10 minutes, right? There are other cryptocurrencies where a block gets mined in less than 10 minutes, right? Where transactions get settled within seconds, within minutes, instantaneously. Why do we have to wait for 10 minutes? Why? What if we reduce it? What if we reduce the block interval to 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, or even a second? What stops us from doing that, right? That's what the question is. I'll not read the entire question. Time does not permit us. So we'll directly go to the answer. First, to address a few, okay, right, let's see this answer. The purpose for the time blocks is giving the network time to propagate the newly found blocks so that all nodes and miners are on the same page, right? So Bitcoin is a decentralized network, right? When a block is mined, the node that mines that block propagates it, right? It's a peer-to-peer network, right? Peers announce. There's no central point of authority that tells you that a block is mined, right? It's a gossiping network. So when a miner mines a block, the miner announces it to the network, right? And there are hundreds and thousands of nodes running at different geographical locations. So obviously there's latency on internet, right? So when one miner announces the information reaches the second miner, the third miner, the fourth miner, by the time all the hundreds and thousands of nodes that are actively participating on the Bitcoin network get informed about this block being mined, it takes some time. That is one of the reasons why we have a 10-minute time interval. So that all that 10 minutes is an adequate amount of time for all the nodes that are on the network to get informed about a block being mined, right? a block being mined. So that is why we give a space of 10 minutes, so that in 10 minutes we certain that every active participant of the network gets the information that a block has been mined. So that before the second block is mined, there is a consensus among all the node runners. Imagine it takes 1 second for a block to propagate through the network and for miners to start building on top of it. So this number includes network latency, but also validation time, the time it takes to build a new candidate set of transactions to include in the next block and to distribute this information to hashes. Miner A finds the block and starts propagating. So miners B, C, and D all learn about this block 1 second later. During that 1 second, B, C, and D are effectively wasting their time as they are trying to build on top of the previous block still. However, A does not waste any time. It can switch to working on top of the new block immediately. This creates a tiny advantage for A, proportional to the probability that another block is found within this 1 second propagation time, right? So, what happens is let's say that we shrink the block interval to 1 second, right? This is something that people who don't understand Bitcoin at times critique Bitcoin about by saying that 10 minutes is too long, a time interval to attain financial settlement. And they claim that Bitcoin cannot sell and Bitcoin cannot be used as a medium of exchange because nobody wants to wait for 10 minutes. And what's the point in having a 10-minute block interval? Look at other cryptocurrencies there, you can settle your payments instantly, right? But the issue is because Bitcoin is decentralized, unlike other currencies that in some way, shape, or form, at some point in time or at some bottleneck are centralized. Okay. So if we assume that we reduce Bitcoin's time interval to 1 second, what will happen? Miner A will mine a block and miner A will propagate that block. By the time miner B gets to know that block, C gets to know that block, D gets to know that block, maybe it takes 5 seconds, maybe it takes 10 seconds, right? Which means miner A has an edge. Miner A knows in the first second, miner is the miner who mined the block. So at the first second, miner A knows that a block has been mined. So miner A can start mining the second block. But miner B gets that information after 5 seconds. C gets that information after 10 seconds. D, let's say, gets that information after 15 seconds. So miner A has an edge, right? Because before miner B, C, and D even get to know that a block has been mined, miner A is already started to mine the second block, right? It has already started to mine the second block, which means that a miner A has an edge on other miners. So a miner who mines a certain block gets a head start as compared to other miners on the network. So if a miner controls a huge amount, considerable amount of hash rate on the network, and we reduce the block interval, then this will lead to further mining centralization because larger miners will get more and more larger because larger miners have a higher probability of finding the blocks. It means they have a higher probability of getting a head start every time they find a block, right? And the lower the time interval, the higher is the probability. So this shrinkage in time interval will lead to further mind centralization and we also need to constant reorganization of folks on the network, right? So if we take an example, if the block time interval is 600%, in that situation, the probability of the miner that mines a block getting a head start is 0.17%. If we reduce it to 60%, it's 1.7%. If we reduce it to 10 seconds, it's 9.5%. And if we reduce it to 1 second, 63%, right? So if the time interval is if the time interval between two Bitcoin blocks is 1 second and two miners have the same hash rate, then the chances of the miner who mined the first block to also mine the second block or the subsequent block is 63% as compared to anybody else on the network, right? So these are some of the harmful effects or some of the trade-offs of having a low block time interval. That's why Bitcoin chooses a 10-minute block interval, which is not very long, such that people cannot use it as a medium of exchange at all, and which is not very short, such that it leads to mining centralization and constant hard forks, right? This is the second question that we had to cover. That is it from my end. I think I took more time than yours, of yours than I should have. The primary reason was that a lot of new folks joined today. So I thought it was important that we understand some concepts in detail, and that is why I went into a little more detail than I usually do, keeping into mind that the audience is relatively new to this session. I hope that you will be able to leverage some value out of the session, even though I admit that this will be overwhelming for most newcomers. But I hope this could be a good starting point and you could have understood or taken at least some pointers out of this session. I will now stop streaming my screen. If any of you have any questions, anything to anything to ask, please do that. And if there's nothing to share or ask, then we can wind the session. I'll wait for a few seconds. If you all have anything to ask or post, please do that. And if nothing, then we can all wind up the session for tonight.